Welcome to Dr. Harmony. They say the deepest scars aren't made by enemies, but by the people we would lay down our lives for. Today's story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the truth, even if that truth shatters your world into a million jagged pieces. Imagine it's your 18th birthday celebration for your only daughter, a milestone you've dreamed of since the day she was born. You expect cake, laughter, and perhaps a sentimental speech. Instead, you are handed a betrayal so cold it freezes the blood in your veins. This is a tale of a father's love, a daughter's dangerous obsession, and the shadow of a man who used a family's heart as his playground. Stay with us until the very end, because the price of this lesson was almost too much to pay. Let's dive into the story. The candles on the cake were flickering, casting long, dancing shadows against the dining room walls. It was my 52nd birthday, but the night wasn't about me. It was about Lynn, my daughter who had just turned 18 a week prior. My wife, Han, had spent the entire afternoon preparing my favorite meal, the aroma of lemongrass and grilled pork filling our modest home. We were a happy family, or so I told myself every morning when I looked in the mirror. I worked long hours at the construction firm to ensure Lynn never lacked anything. She was my pride, my heartbeat, the girl I had carried on my shoulders through every park in this city. As we sat down, Lynn looked different. There was a nervous energy radiating off her, a sharpness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. "Dad," she said, her voice steady but laced with something I couldn't quite identify. "I told you I had a big surprise for your birthday, a gift that changes everything." I chuckled, glancing at Han, who smiled back, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. We assumed it was a college acceptance or perhaps a plan for a trip. "I'm ready, sweetheart," I said, leaning back. "You know I love surprises." Lynn didn't smile. She stood up, walked to the front door, and opened it. I expected her to pull in a large box or maybe a new puppy. Instead, a man walked in. He didn't look like a friend from school. He was tall, wearing a leather jacket that looked more expensive than my car, with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much of the world's darker corners. He looked to be at least 50 years old, my age. The air left the room. I felt a cold chill settle at the base of my spine. "Dad, Mom," Lynn said, her voice rising with a defiant pride that made my stomach churn. "This is Vu. He's the man I love. He's my partner, and he's the surprise I wanted to share with you today." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second sounding like a hammer hitting a nail. Vu stepped forward, offering a hand that I refused to touch. His grip remained firm in the air for a moment before he tucked it into his pocket, with a smirk that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing to my family. "Lynn, this is a joke," Han whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for the table. "He's older than your father. Tell us this is a prank for the video." But Lynn didn't laugh. She stepped beside him, interlacing her fingers with his. The sight of her youthful, soft hand inside his weathered, scarred palm felt like a physical blow to my chest. "It's not a joke," Lynn snapped. "Vu treats me like a woman, not a child. He understands me in ways you never could. We've been seeing each other for 6 months, and I'm done hiding it." My blood began to boil. 6 months? While I was paying for her extra math tutors and her prom dress, this man, this stranger who was old enough to be her father, was whispering in her ear. I stood up, the chair screeching against the tile. "Get out!" I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house before I do something we both regret." Vu didn't flinch. He looked at me with a terrifyingly calm expression. "I understand you're upset," he said, his voice a smooth, calculated rumble. "But Lynn is an adult now. She makes her own choices." Lynn stepped in front of him, shielding him from my gaze. If you kick him out, you kick me out too, she screamed. I love him, Dad, and if you try to stop us, if you try to forbid this, I will leave right now, and you will never see me again. I'll follow him anywhere. My heart shattered. I looked at the daughter I had raised, the girl who used to ask me to check under her bed for monsters, and realized the monster was now standing in my dining room, and she was holding his hand. I saw the manipulation in his eyes, the way he squeezed her hand to prompt her defiance. I saw the trap, but she was blinded by the bait. I felt a bitterness like gall in my throat. I looked at Han, who was weeping silently, and then back at Lin. Then go, I whispered, the words tearing my throat. If you choose a stranger over your blood, then go. I expected her to hesitate. I prayed for a flicker of doubt. Instead, she turned around, grabbed a bag she had already packed and hidden by the door, and walked out into the night with a man who was a ghost to us. She didn't look back. The birthday candles finally burnt out, leaving us in total darkness. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the house like a gunshot, a finality that seemed to vibrate in the very foundation of our home. For a long time, neither Han nor I moved. The birthday cake sat in the center of the table, the icing beginning to sweat under the stagnant heat of the dining room. I looked at the 3 plates, one full of food, one barely touched, and one belonging to a daughter who was now speeding away in a stranger's car. Han's sobbing was the only thing that broke the silence, a low, guttural mourning that made me feel utterly powerless. I wanted to chase after the car. I wanted to drag that man out of the driver's seat and show him the fury of a father whose world had been upended. But I remained frozen. The ultimatum Lin had given me was a blade held to the throat of our relationship, and by telling her to go, I had let the blade slip. In the days that followed, the house became a tomb. Every corner held a ghost of her. There was her favorite coffee mug in the sink, her discarded hoodie on the sofa, and the lingering scent of her perfume in the hallway. I found myself walking into her bedroom at night, staring at the posters on the walls and the stuffed animals she refused to throw away, wondering how a girl who still slept with a teddy bear could believe she was ready for a man like Vu. I replayed that night 1,000 times in my head. I analyzed his face, his tone, the way he carried himself. He didn't look like a man in love. He looked like a man who had won a prize. He had looked at me not with apology, but with a calculated victory. He had taken the most precious thing in my life, just to prove that he could. I tried to call her. Every hour, every day. At first it would ring until the voicemail picked up, her cheerful teenage voice telling me she couldn't come to the phone right now. Then, after 48 hours, the ringing stopped. The calls went straight to a deadline. She had blocked us. She had severed the cord. Han was a wreck. She stopped eating, spent her days scrolling through Lin's social media, looking for any sign of life. But Lin had gone dark there too. No photos of her new life. No check-ins. Nothing. It was as if she had stepped off the edge of the earth. I contacted her friends, but they were just as clueless, or perhaps they were sworn to secrecy. "She's happy, Mr. Nam," one of her classmates told me over the phone, her voice dripping with the misplaced romanticism of youth. "She's finally living her own life. You should let her be." "Living her own life," I shouted into the receiver. "She's with a man who is decades older than her. She's a child." But to them, I was just the overprotective father, the villain in a Romeo and Juliet fantasy. They didn't see the danger. They didn't see that a 50-year-old man who pursues an 18-year-old isn't looking for a partner. He's looking for a victim who doesn't know how to fight back yet. I began to investigate Vu. I spent my nights on the computer digging through public records and social media. I found nothing but dead ends. No last name provided, no workplace mentioned. He was a shadow. A man with no digital footprint is a man with something to hide. and that realization kept me awake until the sun bled through the curtains. 1 month turned into 2. The anger that had initially fueled me began to transform into a heavy, suffocating despair. I started to blame myself. Had I been too strict? Had I worked too many hours and left a void that she felt she needed to fill with the attention of an older man? Han and I started to argue. She blamed my pride. "If you hadn't told her to go, she might still be here," she cried one evening, throwing a dish towel onto the counter. "You pushed her right into his arms." "I was protecting our dignity," I yelled back, though my heart wasn't in it. "I won't let a man like that disrespect our home." But as the weeks crawled by, dignity felt like a very cold companion. I would have traded every ounce of my pride just to see her sitting at the table again, complaining about her homework or talking about her dreams for the future. I started to realize that the big gift she promised me wasn't the introduction of her lover. The gift was the realization of how fragile a family truly is. By the 3rd month, the silence was absolute. We had stopped expecting the phone to ring. We had stopped looking at the door every time a car drove past. I felt myself aging a decade in those 90 days. My hair went grayer, my back stooped, and the light in my eyes dimmed. I felt like a failure. I was a builder by trade. I spent my life ensuring structures were solid and foundations were deep. Yet, I hadn't noticed the cracks in my own daughter's heart until the whole building came crashing down on us. I began to wonder if I would ever see her again, or if the next time I heard her name it would be from a stranger delivering news I wouldn't survive. Little did I know the silence was about to end, and the sound that would break it would be the most heartbreaking thing I had ever heard. The 3rd month was the hardest. It was a Tuesday evening, a night that felt identical to every other miserable night since she left. The rain was drumming a rhythmic, mournful beat against the window panes, and the house felt colder than usual. Han was in the kitchen, mindlessly stirring a pot of soup that neither of us wanted to eat. We lived like ghosts, moving through the motions of a life that had lost its color. Then, above the sound of the rain, there was a noise at the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud, as if someone was leaning their entire weight against the wood. My heart skipped a beat. I looked at Han, and I saw the same spark of terrifying hope in her eyes. I ran to the door, my hands shaking so violently I could barely turn the deadbolt. When the door swung open, the cold wind rushed in, but I didn't feel it. There, huddled on the porch, drenched to the bone and shivering, was Lynn. She looked like a shadow of the girl who had walked out 3 months ago. Her hair, once shiny and well-kept, was matted and dull. Her expensive clothes were stained and torn, and she wasn't wearing shoes, only a pair of thin, soaked socks, but it was her face that broke me. Her eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles that spoke of weeks without sleep, and her lip was swollen. The moment she saw me, her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the floor of the entryway, letting out a cry so primal and filled with agony that it felt like a physical weight pressing on my chest. "Dad! Oh God! Dad!" she sobbed, her voice raw and breaking. She crawled toward me, grabbing the hem of my trousers with a desperation that made my stomach turn. I dropped to my knees and pulled her into my arms. She was so thin, I could feel her ribs through her wet shirt. She clung to me like a drowning person, clinging to a piece of driftwood in a storm. Han was there a second later, wrapping a blanket around her, her own tears falling onto Lynn's matted hair. We didn't ask questions. We didn't lecture. We just held her as she wept, her body racking with tremors that wouldn't stop. It took an hour just to get her into a warm bath and into her old bed, the bed she had abandoned so defiantly. As she drifted into a fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep, I sat by her side, watching her. The anger I had carried for 3 months had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharpened fury directed at the man who had done this. I looked at her hands and saw that her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, and there were faint bruises on her wrists, the kind made by fingers gripping too tight. My little girl had been through a war. I went back to the living room, where Han was sitting, staring at the front door as if expecting the monster to follow her home. "He took everything, didn't he?" Han whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The look in Lynn's eyes when she arrived told the whole story. The next morning, Lynn woke up screaming. It took both of us to calm her down, to remind her that she was safe, that she was home. When she finally stopped shaking, she looked at us with a hollow, haunted expression. The story began to pour out of her in broken fragments. It wasn't the romance she had imagined. From the moment they had left that birthday night, the mask had slipped. Vu hadn't taken her to a luxury apartment or a life of freedom. He had taken her to a cramped, filthy room in a part of the city I never wanted her to see. He told her that since she was an adult now, she had to earn her keep. He had taken her phone, her identification papers, and every cent of the savings I had given her for university. "He told me I was nothing without him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He said you hated me, that you called the police to report me for theft so I could never come back. He told me he was the only one who would ever protect me." It was a classic play. The isolation, the lies, the systematic breaking of a human spirit. She told us how he would leave her locked in the room for days while he was working, and when he came back, he was often drunk and volatile. He had used her as a pawn, a way to hurt me, and a way to satisfy his own twisted need for control. She had been a trophy he won on my birthday, and once the thrill of the win was over, he began to discard her piece by piece. She had escaped while he was in a drunken stupor after a card game. She had jumped from a first-floor window and run through the rain for miles, too afraid to ask for help, too ashamed to face the world, until her feet led her back to the only place where she was truly loved. As I listened, the sheer scale of the deception became clear. This wasn't just a bad relationship. It was a calculated heist of a young girl's life. Vu was a predator who specialized in the rebellious phase, knowing exactly which buttons to push to turn a daughter against her father. He had promised her the world and given her a cage. But as Lynn cried into my shoulder, I realized the nightmare wasn't over. She had come home, but the man who took her wasn't the type to just let his prizes walk away. The relief of having Lynn back was quickly overshadowed by a dark, looming realization. As she began to recover her strength, the true extent of the betrayal started to leak out like venom. It wasn't just her heart and her dignity that Vu had stolen. He had used her youth as a skeleton key to unlock our family's future. One morning while Lynn was staring blankly at a bowl of porridge, a heavy envelope was slid under our front door. There was no stamp, no return address. Inside were photocopies of documents that made the blood drain from my face. They were loan applications, credit card statements, and even a power of attorney form, all bearing Lynn's signature. But the signatures were shaky, some looking forced, others looking like a desperate attempt to mimic her handwriting. "Lynn, what is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as I laid the papers on the table. She looked at them and let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. She explained that during those 3 months, Vu hadn't just kept her prisoner. He had turned her into a professional victim. He had told her that if she truly loved him, she would help him invest in their future. He had used her clean credit history and her status as a legal adult to rack up thousands of dollars in debt. He had convinced her to sign papers he claimed were for a rental lease, but they were actually high-interest loans from people who didn't use banks, people who used muscle to collect. "He said it was for us, Dad," she wailed. "He said we were building a business so we could move away and be happy, but he just took the cash. He spent it on gambling and expensive watches while I was eating instant noodles in that room." I looked at the totals. The debt was staggering, more than I earned in 2 years, but the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization that Vu had targeted our family with surgical precision. He didn't just want a young girl. He wanted a financial windfall. He had scouted us, known I was a hard-working man with savings and used Lynn as the bridge to get to it. He had systematically dismantled her trust in us so she wouldn't question the investments he was making with her name. That afternoon, the first threat arrived. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was no greeting. Just that same smooth, terrifyingly calm voice I remembered from my birthday. "I hope the girl is comfortable," Vu said. I felt a surge of rage so intense, I had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to keep from falling. "You stay away from her," I growled. "I'm calling the police. I have the papers. I know what you did." Vu let out a soft, chilling laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "The police? Go ahead, Nam. Call them. Every single one of those loans has her signature. Every one of those credit cards was opened in her name. If the police get involved, your precious daughter is the one who goes to jail for fraud. I'm just a consultant." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I don't want the girl back," he continued, his tone turning cold. "She was a bore. But I do want the money she owes my associates. $30,000 by the end of the week, or I start sending people to collect. And I don't think your wife's heart could take a visit from the kind of men I work with." The line went dead. I stood there in the silence of the kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear. He had us trapped. He had used Lynn to create a legal and financial cage that would imprison all of us. If I fought him legally, Lynn's future was over before it began. If I paid him, I was feeding a monster who would likely come back for more. I looked through the window and saw Han in the garden, trying to coax Lynn to sit in the sun. They looked so fragile, like glass figures in a storm. I couldn't tell them. Not yet. I had to find a way to fix this without breaking what was left of my family. I went to the bank to check our savings, but the news there was even worse. Lynn had been a co-signer on a small emergency account we kept for her education. It was drained, every cent. Vu had coached her on how to withdraw the maximum amount without triggering a fraud alert. He had bled us dry from the inside out. The betrayal felt like a physical sickness. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, clutching the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I thought about the birthday cake, the candles, and the way Lynn had looked at Vu with such misguided adoration. She had been his weapon, and he had aimed her straight at her own father's heart. I realized then that this wasn't just a story of a girl running away with the wrong man. This was a professional hit on a family's soul. Vu was a scavenger who fed on the vulnerability of the young and the desperation of the old. But as I sat there, the despair started to turn into a cold, hard resolve. He thought I was just a tired old man he could bully. He thought he had won because he held the papers, but he didn't know how far a father would go when he had nothing left to lose but the daughter he had just gotten back. I spent that night in my study, surrounded by blueprints and old construction contracts. But I wasn't looking at buildings. I was looking at the structure of a lie. To defeat a man like Vu, I couldn't act like a grieving father. I had to act like an engineer. I had to find the stress points in his plan and apply pressure until the whole thing buckled. My first step was a silent one. I waited until Han and Lynn were asleep, their breathing heavy with the exhaustion of trauma. And I began to document everything. Every loan paper, every date Lynn mentioned, every subtle bruise I had seen on her wrists. I realized that while Vu was clever, he was also arrogant. Arrogant men always leave a trail because they don't believe anyone is smart enough to follow it. The next morning I didn't go to the construction site. Instead I went to see an old friend, a man named Min, who worked in private security and had spent years dealing with the underbelly of the city. We sat in a dim cafe, the steam from our bitter tea rising between us. I showed him the documents. Min looked at them for a long time, his brow furrowed. "This guy is a pro, Nam," he said, tapping a finger on the signature on the loan application. He's a romance scammer mixed with a loan shark's henchman. He targets families like yours, stable, middle class, with a child just hitting legal age. He doesn't want the girl. He wants the equity in your house. Min explained that Vu likely didn't work alone. Men like him needed a network to process these fraudulent loans and to provide the muscle for the threats. But, Min added, a small grim smile appearing on his face, he's greedy. He told you to pay $30,000 by the end of the week. That's a rush job. It means he's either in debt himself or he's looking to close this account and move on to the next victim. This gave me a window. If I could make him believe I was ready to pay, I could draw him out into the open. But I couldn't just hand over the money. If I did, Lynn would be tied to these debts forever. I needed to prove the signatures were obtained under duress or through outright coercion. I returned home to find Lynn sitting on the floor of her room, shredding old photos of herself. She was trying to erase the girl she used to be, the one who was stupid enough, as she put it, to believe Vu. I sat down beside her and took the scissors from her hand. Lynn, look at me, I said firmly. You are not a criminal. You were a victim of a master manipulator. But if we are going to fix this, I need you to be brave one more time. I need you to remember every place he took you, every person he introduced you to, and every time he made you sign something. At first, she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. He'll kill us, Dad. He said he has people watching the house. I held her shoulders. Let them watch. They're watching a man who's about to lose everything. But they haven't seen what happens when that man decides to fight back. Slowly, painfully, she began to talk. She remembered a small office behind a pawn shop where a man with a gold tooth had laughed while she signed the papers. She remembered a lawyer who never showed his face, only his hands. These were the stress points. These were the people Vu was using to shield himself. I didn't tell Han the details. I couldn't risk her fear giving us away. I spent the afternoon at the bank, but I didn't withdraw the $30,000. Instead, I took out a smaller amount and visited a contact in the tech industry. I needed a way to record a conversation that would stand up in a way a simple phone call wouldn't. I needed a confession. I spent the rest of the day prepping. I felt like I was preparing for a massive concrete pour. Everything had to be perfectly timed, or the whole thing would set wrong and crack. That evening, the phone rang again. It was exactly 7 p.m. Vu was nothing if not punctual. "Do you have my money, Nam?" he asked, his voice dripping with that unbearable smugness. I let my voice tremble, playing the part of the broken, defeated father. I have most of it, but I can't get the rest until the bank opens on Monday. Please, just give us more time. Lynn is sick. She needs a doctor. I heard him chuckle. She's not sick. She's just realizing how useless she is. Fine. Monday. But the price goes up $5,000 for the inconvenience. And Nam, don't try to be a hero. Heroes in this city end up as part of the foundation of the buildings you build. I hung up the phone and looked at my hands. They weren't trembling anymore. I had the bait, and I had the hook. I knew where he was going to be, because Min had tracked the burner phone signal to a specific gambling den in the outskirts of the city. Vu thought he was playing a game of chess with a man who didn't know the rules. But he had forgotten one thing. I built the world he walked on. I knew the shortcuts, the dark alleys, and the way voices carried in empty spaces. I wasn't just going to pay him off. I was going to dismantle his life with the same cold precision he had used on mine. As the sun set, I began to pack a bag. Not with money, but with the tools of a man who was done being a victim. The gambling den was located in the basement of a nondescript warehouse near the docks, a place where the air smelled of stale tobacco and the desperation of men who had lost everything. I arrived just after midnight, the time when the shadows are longest and the law feels furthest away. Min was parked 2 blocks over, listening through a high-gain microphone hidden in the lining of my jacket. My heart was pounding. a rhythmic thud against my ribs that felt like a drumbeat of war. I wasn't a violent man, but as I walked down those concrete stairs, I felt a coldness in my soul that terrified me. I was stepping into Vu's world, a world where morality was a weakness and greed was the only god. The room was filled with low light and the clacking of mahjong tiles. Vu was sitting at a corner table, a glass of expensive cognac in front of him, and a stack of chips that represented more money than I made in 6 months. He looked up as I approached, his eyes narrowing. He didn't look like a romantic lead anymore. He looked like a vulture, perched over a carcass. "You're early, Nam," he said, not bothering to stand. "I told you Monday I don't like my leisure time interrupted by the working class." He gestured to the empty chair across from him, a mocking invitation. I sat down, keeping my hands visible on the table. "I couldn't wait until Monday," I said, my voice intentionally thin and strained. "My wife is falling apart, my daughter. She tried to hurt herself tonight, Vu. She can't live with what you've done." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not pity but a sickening satisfaction. He leaned forward, the scent of his cologne clashing with the grime of the basement. "She always was a bit dramatic," he whispered. "That's why she was so easy to flip. She wanted a movie romance, so I gave her one." "But movies end, Nam. Now we're in the credits, and the credits cost money." "Why her?" I asked, my voice cracking perfectly. "Of all the girls in this city, why did you pick my daughter?" Vu laughed, a dry, rasping sound. He took a sip of his cognac, feeling entirely in control. "Because you were the perfect mark. You're a builder, stable, predictable, and you adore that girl. I've been watching your family for a year. I knew when she turned 18, she'd be looking for a way to prove she was grown up. I just provided the ladder for her to climb down from your tower." He leaned back, his arrogance overflowing. "I didn't even have to try that hard. She was so hungry for real life that she signed those loans without even reading them. She thought she was signing for a love nest. I was signing for a new Mercedes." He was confessing. Every word was being recorded, transmitted to Min, and stored on a cloud server. But I needed more. I needed him to admit to the coercion. "She says you hit her," I said, my voice growing colder. "She says you locked her in that room. Is that part of the real life you promised?" Vu's face hardened, the mask of the sophisticated gentleman slipped, revealing the thug underneath. "She didn't know when to shut up," he snapped. "She started asking questions about where the money was going. I had to remind her who was in charge. A few days of silence and a firm hand usually does the trick. She's lucky I didn't sell her debt to the boys in the north. They aren't as patient as I am." I looked at the folder. The evidence of his crimes was inches away from my hand. I could feel the rage bubbling up, a volcanic heat that threatened to break my composure. I wanted to reach across the table and wrap my hands around his throat. But I remembered the blueprints. A building doesn't fall because you hit it once. It falls because you remove the right support at the right time. "I'll get the money," I said, standing up. "But I want to see her name cleared. I want a receipt." Vu let out a loud, mocking bark of laughter. "A receipt? You really are a pathetic little man. Get out of here. Monday, 6 p.m., same place. Bring the cash or start visiting her in prison." As I walked out of the warehouse, the cool night air hit my face, and I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 3 months. I got into Min's car. He was wearing headphones, his face grim. "Did you get it?" I asked. Min nodded, clicking a button on his laptop. "Everything. The confession of surveillance, the admission of fraud, the physical abuse, and the confirmation that he's the one holding the fraudulent debt. It's a slam dunk, Nam. But there's a problem." He looked at me, his eyes dark with concern. A man like Vu doesn't go to jail quietly. And he wasn't lying. There were 2 men at the door who were definitely armed. If we go to the police now, he might vanish before they can move. Or he might send his friends to your house first. I looked toward the lights of the city, thinking of Han and Lin sleeping at home, unaware of the war I was fighting. I realized that the law was a slow tool for a fast-acting poison. I couldn't just wait for a trial. I had to ensure that when Vu fell, he fell so hard he could never get back up to hurt my family again. I had the recording, but I needed to turn his own greed into his cage. He wants 35,000, I whispered. Let's give him exactly what he deserves. I turned to Min. How fast can you get me a contact in the anti-smuggling unit? Because I think Vu's investments go a lot deeper than just my daughter. Min didn't ask questions, he simply started driving. The plan was shifting from a simple rescue mission into a high-stakes demolition. The anti-smuggling unit has been looking for a guy like Vu for years, Min explained as the city lights blurred past us. They don't care about a broken heart or a family's debt, but they care deeply about the fact that Vu's pawn shop is a front for moving illicit goods and laundering money from the border. If we can link your daughter's fraudulent loans to his main ledger, we don't just get her out of debt, we put him away for 20 years. I felt a cold shiver of realization. I had walked into that basement thinking I was dealing with a predator of hearts. But I was actually dealing with a cog in a much larger, more dangerous machine. The stakes had just doubled. If Vu suspected for a second that I was talking to the authorities, he wouldn't just threaten Lin's credit score. He would erase our entire family to protect his operation. I returned home at 3 a.m., my mind racing with the logistics of the sting. I found Lin sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the darkened garden. She looked small, her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to disappear into herself. "Dad," she whispered as I walked in. "Where were you?" I sat down across from her, taking her cold hands in mine. I couldn't tell her everything. Not yet, but I needed her to be the final piece of the puzzle. "Lin, I need you to remember one more thing. When you were at that office behind the pawn shop, did you see any ledgers, any big black books, or a specific laptop he used?" She frowned, her eyes clouded with the memory of those dark days. He had a safe," she said slowly. "Behind a picture of a mountain in the back office. He made me stand in the corner while he took out the papers for me to sign. He told me, if I ever looked at what was inside, he'd make sure I never saw you again." That was it. The mountain was the weak point. If we could get the authorities into that office while the safe was open, the game would be over. But Vu was careful. He would only open that safe for a reason. I spent the next 48 hours in a fever dream of preparation. I worked with Min and a specialized task force from the police. We weren't just going to show up with handcuffs. We were going to orchestrate a transaction so enticing that Vu's greed would override his caution. The plan was simple but terrifying. I would go to the pawn shop on Monday with the cash, but I would tell him it wasn't enough. I would offer him something he wanted even more. The deed to my family home, signed and ready to be transferred. Han found me in the study on Sunday afternoon, looking at the house's title deed. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat on the arm of my chair and put her head on my shoulder. "You're going to use the house as bait, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded, the weight of the gamble pressing down on me. "It's the only thing big enough to make him open that safe, Han. He thinks I'm desperate. He thinks I'm a fool who would trade everything to save a daughter who betrayed me. I need him to keep believing that." Han squeezed my hand. "She didn't betray us, Nam. She was stolen from us. Get her back, truly back, even if we have to sleep on the floor of a rented room. Just bring our daughter's soul home. Monday morning arrived with a gray, oppressive sky. The police had wired me again, but this time with a device so small it was hidden inside a button on my shirt. They had units positioned in unmarked vans 2 blocks away from the pawn shop. I felt like I was walking onto a construction site where the scaffolding was made of paper. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and the whole thing would collapse on top of me. I pulled up to the pawn shop, a dingy building with barred windows and a heavy steel door. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest, but my face was a mask of stone. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and old metal. Vu was waiting in the back office, leaning against a desk that was cluttered with expensive watches and gold jewelry, the spoils of other families he had dismantled. "You look tired, Nam," he said, checking his own watch. "I hope you have the bag. My associates are starting to lose their patience. They were talking about visiting your wife's garden this morning." The threat was casual, delivered with the ease of a man who had made such threats 1,000 times. I threw a small duffel bag onto the desk. It contained $10,000, all the cash I could scrape together, and a stack of paper. "It's not all there," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of genuine fear and practiced desperation. Vu's eyes flared with anger. He grabbed the bag and zipped it open, dumping the cash onto the desk. "10,000? Are you mocking me? I told you 35. I stepped forward, pulling the deed to the house from my inner pocket. "I don't have the rest in cash, but I have this. This house is worth 5 times what I owe you. It's been in my family for 3 generations. Take it. Take the house, give me the papers, and leave my daughter alone." Vu froze. He looked at the deed, then back at me. I saw the gears turning in his head. A house was a permanent asset, a way to wash his money and secure a base of operations. It was the ultimate prize. He walked over to the wall and swung back the picture of the mountain. My breath hitched in my throat. I heard the mechanical click of the safe's combination. As the heavy steel door creaked open, Vu reached inside, pulling out a thick leather-bound ledger and the manila folder containing Lynn's fraudulent debts. "You really are a pathetic father, Nam," he sneered, reaching for a pen. "But you're a very generous donor." He turned his back to me to lay the ledger on the desk, and in that split second, I pressed the signal button in my pocket. The silence of the shop was about to be shattered by the sound of justice. The sound of the front door being breached was like a clap of thunder in the cramped, dusty office. Before Vu could even turn his head, the glass partition of the shop shattered inward. "Police, don't move! Hands where I can see them!" The shouts were a chaotic symphony of authority, but for a moment time seemed to slow down. Vu's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The smug, calculated mask of the businessman dissolved into the raw, panicked snarl of a cornered animal. His first instinct wasn't to surrender. It was to reach for the ledger and the deed on the desk, his hands clawing at the evidence of his greed. "Get back!" I yelled, stepping forward with a surge of adrenaline I didn't know I possessed. I slammed my hand down on the ledger, pinning it to the desk. Vu looked at me, his eyes wide with a realization that was almost comical. He didn't see the pathetic little man anymore. He saw the architect who had designed his downfall. He lunged at me, his fingers curling into claws, but he never reached me. 2 officers in tactical gear swarmed into the office, their boots thudding on the floorboards. They tackled him across the desk, scattering the $10,000 in cash like autumn leaves. "Nam! Get out of here! Now!" Min's voice barked through the earpiece. I backed away, my chest heaving, as the officers forced Vu's face down onto the very documents he had used to enslave my daughter. He was screaming now. Curses, threats, promises of a slow and painful death for me and my family. But his voice sounded thin and hollow against the backdrop of the sirens wailing outside. The power he had held over us for 3 months was nothing more than an illusion built on fear, and the illusion had just been set on fire. As they led him out in handcuffs, his expensive leather jacket was torn, and his hair was disheveled. He looked small. Without the shadows of the gambling den and the protection of his thugs, he was just a middle-aged criminal who had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated the quiet strength of a man who builds things to last. One of the lead investigators, a woman with a sharp gaze and a no-nonsense air, walked over to the desk. She looked at the ledger, then at the deed to my house. She picked up the deed and handed it back to me. "You're a very lucky man, Mr. Nam," she said, "and a very brave one. This ledger alone is enough to shut down 3 different smuggling rings. We've been trying to get a look inside this safe for 2 years." I took the deed, my fingers trembling as I folded it and put it back in my pocket. The house was safe. The future was still ours. But as I walked out of the pawn shop, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a crushing weight of exhaustion. I saw Vu being shoved into the back of a police van, and for a fleeting second, our eyes met. There was no more smugness, only a cold, dark void of hatred. I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. I just felt a profound sense of sadness that this man had been able to walk into our lives and cause so much damage in such a short amount of time. Min met May at the perimeter, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Nam. The lawyer and the man from the pawn shop were picked up 10 minutes ago. The paper trail is solid. Lin's name will be cleared by the end of the month." I nodded, unable to find the words. I looked at the morning sun finally breaking through the gray clouds, its light reflecting off the shards of glass on the sidewalk. It was a beautiful sight, but it felt distant. My mind was already at home, thinking of the long road ahead for Lin. We had won the battle against the predator, but the wounds he had left on her soul wouldn't be healed by a police raid or a cleared credit report. When I pulled into our driveway, Han was waiting on the porch. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just looked at my face and knew. We stood there in the quiet of the morning, the neighborhood waking up around us, blissfully unaware of the war that had just concluded. "Where is she?" I asked. Han pointed toward the back garden. I walked through the house, past the dining table where it had all started 3 months ago, and out into the yard. Lin was sitting on the wooden bench I had built for her when she was 10. She was staring at a butterfly hovering over the jasmine bushes. I sat down beside her, not saying a word. After a long minute, she leaned her head against my shoulder. "He's gone, Lin," I whispered. "He's never coming back." She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and took a long, shaky breath, the first real breath of a free person. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she said, her voice barely audible. "I wanted to be an adult so badly that I forgot how to be your daughter." I put my arm around her, pulling her close. "You never stopped being my daughter," I said. "And being an adult means learning that the people who love you are the ones who build you up, not the ones who try to own you." We sat there for a long time, the architect and his masterpiece, starting the slow, difficult process of reconstruction. The days following the arrest were not filled with the cinematic joy one might expect. Instead, they were filled with a heavy, quiet exhaustion. The drama of the confrontation was over, but the trauma remained, a thick fog that refused to lift from our hallways. We were a family again, physically under one roof, but the air between us was fragile. Like a bridge held together by the thinnest of wires, Lin spent most of her time in her room. The defiance that had once flared in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, hollow shame. Every time I looked at her, I saw her flinch, as if she were waiting for me to throw her mistakes back in her face. I realized then that the betrayal wasn't just what she had done to us, it was what she felt she had done to herself. She had let a predator use her as a weapon against her own father, and that realization was a poison she was drinking every day. I had to be careful. If I was too kind, she felt she didn't deserve it. If I was too firm, she thought I was still angry. I went back to work at the construction sites. But my heart wasn't in the steel and concrete. I spent my lunch breaks reading about psychological manipulation and how to help victims of grooming and coercive control. I learned that Vu hadn't just dated her. He had dismantled her identity, piece by piece, until she believed she was nothing more than his shadow. One evening I found her in the kitchen, staring at the back of her hands. "He told me I was the one who signed the papers, Dad," she whispered, without looking up. "He made me believe it was my idea. He made me feel like I was the mastermind of our family's ruin. How could I be so stupid? I was 18. I thought I knew everything." I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. I didn't reach for her hand. I waited for her to reach for mine. "Lynn, a master thief doesn't break into a house that has nothing worth stealing. He targeted you because you had a big heart and a bright future. He didn't love you. He loved the opportunity you represented. That's not your fault. That's his crime." The legal process was a slow, grinding machine. Detectives came by to take more statements. They showed us photos of other girls, some younger than Lynn, who hadn't been as lucky. Some were still missing. Others had been left in debt so deep they would never recover. Seeing those photos changed something in Lynn. The shame began to turn into a quiet, cold anger. She realized she wasn't the only one. She realized that Vu was a professional who specialized in the 18th birthday window, that specific moment when a child is legally an adult but still has the emotional vulnerability of a teenager. Han and I started taking her to a counselor, a woman who specialized in victims of fraud and domestic abuse. It was slow going. There were days when Lynn wouldn't speak a word, and days when she would scream at the walls, mourning the version of herself that died on my 52nd birthday. But slowly, the doctor harmony within our home began to find its rhythm. We stopped talking about the money. The $35,000 was a ghost. The police had frozen Vu's assets, and while we might never see the cash again, the debts were being systematically declared fraudulent. We had our house. We had our lives. But the world outside wasn't as forgiving. Our neighbors whispered. People in our small community knew that girl who ran off with an old man and brought the police to her father's door. I saw the way people looked at her at the grocery store, the pity mixed with judgment. It made me want to roar, to tell them that they didn't know the half of the courage it took for her to jump out of that window and run back to us. But I stayed silent. I learned that the best way to protect her wasn't to fight her battles, but to stand behind her while she fought them herself. One Sunday, Lynn asked me to help her pack up the last of the things she had brought back from that apartment. There was a leather jacket Vu had bought her, likely with my own money. She held it over the trash can, her hands trembling. "I thought this made me look like a woman," she said, her voice cracking. "Now, it just feels like lead." She dropped it in and closed the lid. It was a small moment, but it felt like a major structural victory. We were clearing the debris. We were preparing the site for something new. The most difficult part was the upcoming trial. The prosecutor told us that Lynn would have to testify. She would have to stand in a room, look at the man who had broken her, and tell the world exactly how he did it. The fear in the house returned. A cold draft that wouldn't go away. Lynn began to have nightmares again, dreaming that Vu had escaped and was waiting for her in the shadows of the garden. I stayed up those nights sitting in the hallway outside her door, a silent guardian. I realized that the gift of that birthday had been a terrible one, but it had forced us to build a foundation of honesty that we never had before. We weren't the perfect family anymore, but we were a real one. And as the date for the trial approached, I knew that the final test of our strength was yet to come. The day of the trial arrived with a biting chill in the air. The courthouse was a gray, imposing monolith that seemed to represent the weight of the last few months. As we walked up the stone steps, I felt Lynn's hand slip into mine. Her grip was tight, her knuckles white, But she didn't look down. She wore a simple white blouse and black trousers, no longer the girl in the leather jacket, but a young woman who had walked through fire and refused to turn to ash. Han walked on her other side, a silent pillar of maternal strength. We were a united front, a structure designed to withstand the final storm. Inside the courtroom, the air was sterile and smelled of old paper and floor wax. When Vu was led in, the room seemed to grow colder. He was dressed in a suit, attempting to reclaim the persona of the sophisticated businessman. But the illusion was gone. Without his expensive toys and his controlled environments, he looked like what he truly was, a predator who had aged out of his own game. He tried to catch Lin's eye, a predatory smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth, but she didn't flinch. She looked straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the judge. The testimony was grueling. For hours, the prosecution laid out the evidence, the recordings I had made, the ledgers from the safe, and the long list of other victims who had finally found the courage to come forward once Vu was behind bars. But the turning point came when Lin took the stand. I sat in the front row, my heart in my throat as she was asked to recount those 3 months of hell. Her voice started as a whisper, a fragile thread of sound, but as she spoke about the manipulation, the isolation, and the moment she realized her love was actually a ransom note, her voice grew into a steady, powerful resonance. "He didn't love me," she told the court, her eyes finally locking onto Vu's. "He loved the fear he could put in my father's eyes. He used me as a tool to break a good man. But he failed because my father didn't give up on me, even when I gave up on myself." The courtroom was silent. Even the defense attorney seemed to lose his appetite for cross-examination. The evidence was overwhelming, but the human truth was undeniable. Vu's arrogance had been his undoing. He had recorded his own crimes in that ledger, a testament to a lifetime of destroying families. The jury didn't take long. When the foreman stood up to read the verdict, guilty on all counts from fraud and coercion to aggravated assault, I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders. Vu was sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of early parole. As the guards led him away, he didn't look at us. He looked at the floor, a broken man who had finally run out of people to hurt. The debt that had loomed over our heads was legally dissolved, the signatures declared void by the court. We were free, not just from the money, but from the shadow of the man who had tried to steal our sunlight. We walked out of the courthouse into a late afternoon sun that felt warmer than it had in years. We didn't celebrate with a grand party. We went home, ordered a simple meal, and sat together in the garden. For the first time, we talked about the future without the prefix of if or when. Lin spoke about going back to school, not for what I wanted her to study, but for what she was passionate about: social work, to help other young women navigate the traps that predators like Vu set every day. She had found a purpose in her pain, a way to turn her scars into a map for others. I looked at my daughter and realized that while I was the one who had planned the sting and recorded the confession, she was the real architect of our recovery. She had done the hardest work, the internal labor of forgiveness and the reconstruction of her own soul. My 52nd birthday had been the worst day of my life, but as I sat there watching the sunset with my wife and daughter, I realized that the big gift Lin had promised me had finally arrived. It wasn't the man she brought home. It was the woman she had become through the struggle. We were a family built on a foundation of truth, and that is a structure that no predator can ever knock down. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey here at Dr. Harmony. This story serves as a powerful reminder to protect the ones we love and never lose hope, even in our darkest hours. If this story touched your heart or gave you a new perspective, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of resilience and truth. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the human heart. Thank you for watching, and stay strong.